Thank you so much. I learned a lot from that. I want to shift gears for a second to economics. I'm here to tell you that I'm not a bigot. I'm just an economist who has pragmatic, economic, and socially responsible concerns about the effects on the United States of admitting flooding the labor market with millions of new workers. You don't need more than Economics 101 to know that when millions of new workers, especially low-skilled workers, enter a labor market, they're going to drive down the price of labor, and the main burden of that is going to be borne by the least skilled and most vulnerable Americans. And this is not bigotry. This is hard economic research. Top economists like MIT's Daron Acemoglu and David Autor have found that the entry of millions of new low-skilled workers into the U.S. labor market did depress the wages of some workers who were already there, particularly the least skilled. And I think it's clear what the policy proposal is for socially responsible people like you and me. It's to put tight limits on that entry, maybe a pause, a suspension of that entry for a while. And really, the socially responsible among us, the truly altruistic, would focus on making things better where those workers are coming from so that they can live there in dignity and don't need to come here. Now, everything I've said up until this point is, I think, the starting point for a lot of Americans that I know and talk to when they think about the economics of immigration. And I think it's a legitimate and reasonable starting point. But I want to argue to you that if it's also the ending point, if it's where we stop thinking about the economics of immigration, we've really missed most of what's important. I'd even say almost all of what's important. And the clearest way I can communicate that to you is to say that everything I've said up until now, since I came up here, is actually true. There's nothing factually false in it, even though I've been talking the entire time about women, about female labor force entry. That's what that paper by Daron Acemoglu, David Autor, and Lyle in the Journal of Political Economy is about. It's about the entry of millions of lower skilled women into the US labor force after World War II, noting that it did have labor market effects on people who were already there, male workers, and particularly male workers with less than a high school degree. But if I went from there to policy proposals like, let's have tight legal restrictions or legal bans on women entering the labor force, your reaction might be, well, that's ridiculous, and nobody would ever propose that anyway. I'd agree with you that it's ridiculous. I wouldn't agree with you that nobody would ever propose that, because that actually was the law for applying to most women in most of the United States for roughly the first century and a half, depending on the state that you're talking about in this country. It was once illegal almost everywhere for married women to own property, sign contracts, patent inventions, run a business as a sole proprietor. And there were many other restrictions that outlasted those laws, including limitations on the hours that women could work, the wages for which they could work, and the occupations they could work in. So legal bans on women are actually something that good, reasonable, moral people actually once supported in their huge majority. And they actually did it. They explained very clearly why they were doing it, and one of the biggest reasons often cited was the effects on men's wages of female labor force entry. So this is something that is part of our history, and was actually done. Now, looking back on that, we see how I don't have a good word for it. How meager a conception of the economic effects of female labor force entry that is. Even though it was true that there was some limited degree of wage competition, we know now the story was just dramatically bigger than that. Women created businesses. They created entire new industries. It turned out they didn't behave and think precisely like men when they entered the labor force, and that was a good thing, so that they ended up complementing men on factory floors and in boardrooms. And they patented inventions. Even in a much deeper sense, they changed the definition of what us is. So it would make sense in the 1890s to say, well, what are these women entering the factories going to do to us? But now that's a nonsensical statement. Of course, women in factories are us. Immigrants do all the exact same things. Mushfiq talked about entrepreneurship. I'm not sure many people are aware that 40% of the Fortune 500 were created by immigrants or the children of immigrants. How's that for job creation? For the reasons that we saw in the video, which I thought was quite eloquent and concise, immigrants tend to complement rather than substitute for the vast majority of natives in the labor market, although limited degrees of competition do exist in some times and places. Immigrants tend to be much more geographically mobile than native workers, which means they tend to equilibrate local labor markets. That is, when there's a negative shock, such as a plant closing, immigrants moving away and seeking an opportunity elsewhere cushion native workers who are less mobile from the blow. And so many other ways that they affect the economy, including the labor market, that are just dramatically more complicated than a single labor market where their existence drives down wages. What about the other policy proposal I outlined for you, that if we're socially minded, we should be making things better where they come from? This too was a focus of policy to address female labor force entry. Much of the discussion that survives in books and speeches and Yale University studies, among other things, about how to address female labor force participation from the late 1800s and the early 20th century was about making conditions better for male workers. Why? Because women working for pay is something that they do when their husbands can't earn enough to support them. And we want to eliminate that necessity, along with the social harms that it brings, the dissolution of marriages and the harm to neglected children, by ensuring that men can earn enough. This is why the first wave of minimum wage laws in the United States between 1912 and the late 1920s didn't apply to men, not one of them. There weren't state-level minimum wage laws that applied to all workers until the late 30s and 40s in the United States. The first wave was all about making sure that employers couldn't employ women at low wages because they were seen as that was seen as employers using women as cheap labor to undercut the wages of men, which was just a self-reinforcing cycle, because when men's wages go lower, working class families can't earn enough and women are forced to participate in the labor market. Of course, that's a bizarre vision now of female labor force participation. Of course, as the U.S. got richer and there was much more economic opportunity for families, for men, female labor force participation didn't go down because women didn't need to work anymore. It went way up. It's 4 times now what it was in the early 20th century, even though essentially all households in the United States are much richer than they were at that time. And we know intuitively why that is. Both economic development of the United States encouraged female labor force participation in complex ways. It raised the opportunity cost of childbearing time. It created entire new industries that they could participate in. It encouraged investment in the education of girls. But also, it was a virtuous cycle. Of course, women entering the labor force contributed to economic development, and they went up together. They weren't substitutes for each other. That's actually the same thing goes on with immigration from poor countries. There's this idea, especially in regards to the migrant crisis in Europe, that if foreign aid can just develop Africa in some sense, people won't want to leave. It's actually a myth, a fantasy that as poor countries get richer, fewer people leave them. That's not the empirical record. If you look at the last the last 2 generations of data, as poor countries, by which I mean a few $100s per capita per year in GDP per capita, go to middle-income countries, a few $1,000s in income per capita. As you go from being Malawi or Laos to being like Albania or Algeria, the emigration rate doesn't fall. It doesn't even stay flat. It triples. It goes way, way up. Economic development is not a substitute for people leaving. It complements people leaving. And for many of the same ways that female labor force participation and economic development complemented each other. Immigration tends to reflect development success. Development success creates, among other things, typically a youth bulge through the demographic transition, and it tends to encourage the development process at home. It builds trade networks. It attracts foreign direct investment. It encourages the transfer of technologies to developing countries of origin. And the very idea that somehow we can prevent migration by socially minded altruism, giving enough money to Africa and creating jobs in Africa is something that sounds nice on paper, but has nothing to do with the development experience, which typically is accompanied by more migration. And I think our intuition about why economic development didn't end up meaning more women stayed at home is helpful in that regard. So I just want to close by suggesting a completely different way to think about the economics of migration that really gets at some of these big picture issues. Not as a labor market nuisance, not as a sign of development failure that we haven't been altruistic enough, but as a vast opportunity. And in that I'd include a business opportunity, an opportunity to actually add value to the world economy and to capture that value and to do things with it. And that comes from an arbitrage opportunity at the heart of migration that Mushfiq alluded to. The fact, and it's a remarkable fact, that the same person typically now working in poor countries is dramatically more productive in rich countries, hundreds of % more productive, not just a little bit. That's an arbitrage opportunity. I call it $1 trillion bills on the sidewalk because it means that even relatively small movements add up to huge new value for the world economy that can be captured with new institutions. Here again, female labor force participation teaches a lot. The US between 1960 and 2010 got much richer over that half century. Why was that? New technologies, new industries. A stunning paper forthcoming in the economics journal Econometrica by CA and co-authors estimates that 22% of that economic gain to the United States over that period was just due to white women only being better allocated to education and occupational opportunities that were aligned with their natural talents. 22% of all the economic growth in America was just due to that, just white women by themselves. I don't mean to suggest that the low-skilled men of the 1950s who had additional competition are irrelevant. They're not irrelevant. That was important, and I think it was important for public policy and social safety nets to address their needs. But if we were to focus entirely on that and not about where 22% of our new wealth came from over the last half century, it would be kind of bizarre. We'd be missing the big picture. We'd be missing almost all of what's important. And that's where our focus, I think, on immigration should lie as well. We need a dramatic expansion of new institutions, public institutions and new private institutions, new businesses in order to capture the potential of that amazing arbitrage opportunity at the international level. It doesn't mean that displacement doesn't exist. It doesn't mean that any of this is easy. Certainly female labor force participation required all kinds of new public and private sector institutions to capture that massive value. It wasn't just about tearing down walls. It was about building stuff. Sexual harassment laws had to be written. Networks of private childcare facilities had to be created by entrepreneurs. All kinds of things had to be built. That's what we need to be doing on immigration policy right now to capture this opportunity. Some of you in this room are some of the best positioned people in the world to do it, and I hope we can talk about specific ways to do that in our discussion. Thanks.